I included, right? Did you hit the AI? There you go. Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night. I'm glad to see you're here joining us on Nativ. It's a wonderful channel, and I'm looking forward to attempting to teach you something today. This is lesson 4 in Daniel chapter 11. And I can tell you with all honesty, we will not get through chapter 11 tonight, and we may not get through chapter 11 next week. It is rich. It is, well, let's put it this way. Since I met um, Chuck Dobbs, I'm finding myself getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and studying for 4 to 6 hours, trying to assimilate what he's already learned in 12 years. And I can tell you honestly, it's not that easy, but I'm very excited about what I've learned so far, and I hope I can get that across to you folks too. Ross, can you put up that first slide? Or do I have control of that? There it is. We started spent last week talking about this slide. And what it is my attempt to show you a timeline of Daniel's 70 weeks. Now, for the longest period of time, when I talked about 70 weeks, when I was in my Christian mode and when I was even in my Jewish mode, I looked at it entirely different than I'm doing these days. The best I could do was 90. Well, you had 70 times sevens would have given you 490 years. Now I'm understanding 70 weeks, according to Daniel, is actually 3,430 years. And it all boils down to defining words, giving yourself an understanding of what the word actually means. And that required something that I never bothered to do, and that was to create my own timeline. When we were talking earlier tonight about water and how water has the attribute of flowing, the same thing is true of time. Time flows. Sometimes time appears to go faster than other times. Sometimes as we're going through this, some of the things that you're going to be looking at are, well, slowed down for you. When other times they're going to be quite rapid. Here in chapter 11 of this story, one of the things that's going to happen to you, this is interesting. I don't know about my Blue Ridge Bible. But anyway, back to the story. One of the things that I find fascinating is the fact that all of chapter 11 deals with almost 3,000 years. And so in looking at that, actually 2,300 some years is what it amounts to. But as you're going through that, there are very big periods of time that don't seem to have anything. And so as I'm going around and looking at what's going on, I want you to notice that the time for 70 weeks begins in 1406. That was the year that Joshua caused the children of Israel to cross the Jordan and came into the land. That was during that first month of that cycle of Jubilee. Now, if we go through time, one of the things that becomes obvious is that Daniel in chapter 9 said we need to know that it's 77 weeks, 62 weeks, and another period of 7 weeks, or another period of weeks after that. Total 70 weeks. Turn over to the next slide, if you would, Ross. Can you? Or do I? Too far. There you go. That's what I'm looking for. We've talked about Nebuchadnezzar. We went through chapter 2 and we talked about the parts of the statue. And we talked about the fact that the head was gold and the arms and the breastplate were silver, and that the belly area, the thighs, those were brass or copper, if you would, and the legs were iron. But I didn't spend any time talking to you about the feet. And yet the feet are probably the most important. It gives the stability to all of what we're going to be studying. And so I have never really taken time to understand how this whole being, including the feet, fits into the period of time which we call the end of days. And so I began to look at this for an opportunity to understand. Time did not stand still after the destruction of the Second Temple, or the First Temple, for that matter. All of it had to be included in this character that we're looking at. Those feet, those toes, have to represent periods of time. In fact, a great amount of time included. If I were to just give you a guess, I know that the iron legs represented Rome. But did you realize that Rome split and Constantine took what he called Rome to Istanbul, or to Turkey? And actually it's Istanbul today, but it was back then, he called it Constantinople. Well, in taking it there, we now have a new period of time. And what happened was Constantinople lasted for several hundred years. But like everything else, it collapsed, or just faded into the sunset, actually. That was the Byzantine period. After the Byzantine period, we had the Islamic period, the period of time with Muhammad, the 13th century, 14th century. After that, we had it going on for a reasonable length of time. It was intermixed with the Crusades. And after the Crusades and during the Crusades, then we had the Ottoman Empire. And after the Ottoman Empire, then we have another look at what we call the British, who make up a part of those feet. Lots of time has been spent. And what we've failed to look at is that we have at least 1,260 years wrapped up in those toes that we haven't even spent time talking about. Ross, flip to the next one, if you would, please. That's okay. When we looked at it before, we looked at it again from a different point of view. We looked at it from the point of view of chapter 7, when we looked at beasts as opposed to a statue. Again, we learned that Babylon was the lion with wings. We learned Medo-Persia was the great big bear that raised up on one side and had ribs in its mouth. And the third empire was the Grecian Empire with 4 heads, and it had 4 wings. And then we came to what we called the Roman or the Edomite Empire. That's the last of them. But remember the last verses in that page? Notice what it says. Verse 26, and the judgment shall be established, and they will remove his dominion to be destroyed and annihilated until the end. Until the end. They took away his power, but he's here till the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under all the heavens will be given to the people of the high holy ones. Its kingdom is a perpetual kingdom, and all dominions will serve and obey it. When? Until here is the end of the matter. Now, as for me, Daniel, my thoughts terrified me greatly, and my colors changed upon me. I kept the matter in my heart. So Daniel has seen the statue. Daniel has now seen these creatures. Now what's next? He's got pieces in his head, but the pieces haven't fit together yet, because there's these strange words that he has to deal with and numbers that he's going to be looking at. He'll look at time, times, and a half time. He'll look at 1,260 days. He'll look at 1,290 days. He'll look at 1,335 days. He's going to look at numbers. And as he does, he still doesn't understand. In fact, he had to go his way in chapter 12 at the very end. Go your way until the very end. Now, what we know from what we've studied so far, Daniel was given these dreams and these visions, and he was given all of these things, but he still didn't understand everything. Just like we don't understand everything that's here. Just like I can't tell you that I'm sure that I understand everything correctly. But I think I'm on a better track than I was 6 weeks ago or 8 weeks ago. I think today, like I was saying to my friends, I was up at 2 o'clock this morning. I'm getting up early, coming in and studying for 4, 5, 6 hours by myself and trying to grasp all the numbers and all of the pictures that are going on in my head. Turn to the next one, would you, Dross? In going through this, we understand that chapter 11 begins, and if you got your Bible, you look at chapter 11 for a second, would you? If you're looking at chapter 11, you're on verse 3, so turn back one more. You'll be back to verse 1. It begins by saying, do you know why I came to you? Do you understand what's going on? You see, Daniel was a person that was specially selected for this. Now, Daniel was a member of the royal family or the royal house. He wasn't the immediate heirs to anything. He was a very bright young man at the time that he was brought there. As we begin to look at all of the things that are happening, we recognize the fact that when Jehoiakim was finally taken captive, that they also brought 10,000 others with him. But did you know that they brought more than people? Remember when Belshazzar has his feast, they break out the silverware, they break out the plates, they break out all of the accoutrements that were used in the temple. Now, if you're taking all of those from the temple and bringing them to where you're at, how do you have temple service? What are you going to have to do to make it right? Oh, by the way, they not only took some of them, but according to the writings, they even took the menorah. In other words, the temple was not right after Jerusalem was sacked. The reason they took so many things is because Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make sure that you would pay him what you owe him. And after all, Jehoiakim decided he was going to make a treaty with somebody else. He was going to get a better deal than what he was getting with Nebuchadnezzar. And Neb did not like that. And so he came to take his reward. So in that first verse, it goes on to say, now I will return to do battle with the heavenly prince of Persia, and then I will depart. But behold, the heavenly prince of Greece approaches. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in truthful writings. Now, my Bible, the Art Scroll, tells me the truthful writings that they're talking about here are, well, it's, there it is. The three kings after Darius and Cyrus and Ahasuerus and all of these other things. He's going to tell us about that. But let me talk to you for a second about just the simple word Persia. Persia. You know, Persia isn't Persian. Persia is Greek. The Greeks named the country Persia. The Persians called themselves Aryans. Maybe that's where Adolf Hitler came up with the topic or the understanding of the Aryan race. But the Persians did not call themselves that. Not only that, the Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks. They called themselves Hellenists. Who called them Greeks? Rome. Rome gave them that title. The title called Palestine. Where did it come from? Well, it came from Rome. They called it that. Now, they called it that for the purpose of making sure that nobody understood that Israel was the rightful owner of the land. So they changed it. But that's not what the Jewish people called it. They called it Israel. So as you begin to go through language, you begin to go through titles, you begin to see things that are a lot different than what you would normally have thought. He goes on to say in verse number 3, which is already up here for you, and a mighty king will arise and will rule. And notice what else it says. This mighty king that's going to arise and he's going to rule. What about him? What about him? Well, as you begin to look at it, this character is going to be ruling, he is only one of a series of kings. He's not all the kings. I gave you a little map there to show you how much land that the Persians actually had. When it was all said and done, when Darius the Persian, which was Esther's son, when the nation was defeated, this is how much land they possessed. Everything from Greece all the way over to the Indus River in India. Down south, all of this was theirs. And that's what the Greeks conquered, all that land that belonged to them. Now, that's an interesting story because you see, Alexander the Great wasn't considered a Greek. He wasn't considered a Hellenist either. You see, he was from Macedonia. He was from the sticks. He was a hillbilly. He was not considered cultured. He was just, well, he was a redneck. That's how they would have defined him back then if they used those same terms. But you see, one of the things that Alexander the Great's father did for him was he got him a good teacher. In fact, he got him the best teacher that was available. He got him Aristotle. You see, Aristotle taught him science. Aristotle taught him philosophy. He taught him all of the major things. That was what Aristotle gave to Alexander. He gave him the wisdom necessary in order to solve problems, to work through situations that seemed nearly impossible, because his army was never as big as the armies that he conquered. He was always smaller, but he was a great tactician. He knew what to do. And so he began to rule. And as he ruled, he began to leave behind cities where he would stockpile men and instruments, machines, guns. We've seen that in the Gaza, haven't we? Almost anywhere you look, there were guns in somebody's room in their house. The same thing was what Alexander was doing. Do you know he had 25 cities named across his empire that had his name, Alexander, on it? That's how they knew when they were in one of those cities that he established for the purpose of taking care of his troops. The greatest one was Alexandria, Egypt. That's where he was buried. In fact, they're still looking for his actual burial because they believe it's actually in the Mediterranean. So nobody really knows exactly where it's at, but they have a very good idea where it's at. Now, Alexander was able to take advantage of the instability. First, the instability in Greece, because remember, the Greeks and the Persians had been fighting a war for 55 years. We're only, 75 days into the Gaza war, and I'm tired, and I'm sure you are too, listening to all the things that are going on, and the world is tired of it. Imagine 55 years. And so after 55 years, they were basically wore out. They had used up all of their supplies. And so Alexander, and actually his father Philip started it, began to conquer the states in Greece, the city-states, Athens and Sparta and Corinth and all of the rest of them. They began to move across Greece. And then they moved from Greece, they crossed the Hellespont, they crossed the Bosporus, and they ended up in Turkey, and they began to conquer the land that was conquered by the Persians. And they moved from place to place. Now, Alexander was not interested in suppressing the people. His philosophy was that we will bring to them intellect, but we won't change their culture. We'll allow them to be who they are, but will encourage them all the way. And so everywhere that they went, they began to develop ties with the community. Alexander encouraged his men to intermarry. In fact, they stayed an extra long period of time in Babylon and in Susa, which was the capital of Persia, for the purpose of making sure his men intermarried. He wanted his people to be tied to the land, and he wanted the people in the land to be tied to him. In fact, when he was in Egypt, this is a story, when he was in Egypt, he was there long enough to begin to pick up the dialect of the Egyptians. He was there long enough to understand their gods. In fact, he even went to their temples and worshiped their gods. Can you imagine how that ingratiated him with the people? The people began to accept him. In fact, he built Alexandria, and he built a house there for himself to live in. He built a place where he would even die and be buried, not back in Macedonia. He was buried in Alexandria, Egypt. He became a part of what he was, and they became a part of him. Now, he was able to take advantage of the instabilities, but at the same point in time, there was a lot of challenges to what he was doing in conquering all of these places and establishing bases for all of his men and maintaining everything that they needed. But he did. Now, when he rises, his kingdom will be broken again. And in fact, it will be divided into 4 directions. The 4 directions of heaven is what they say. But not for his posterity. You see, he only had one son. And when he was on his deathbed, they asked him a question. Who should take your place? You know what his answer was? It wasn't his son. His son actually ended up dying of a disease, just like Alexander did. No, he simply said, the strongest shall replace me. After he said that and he passed on, it took 15 years for it finally to be sorted out. 15 years of squabbling among his generals as to who was the fittest, who deserved to have the land. You want to flip it again, Ross? As we go through this then, in understanding, one of the things that I want you to really draw from this is the fact that Alexander had a plan. It was a good plan, and it was working. I think that's just the same slide that was up, right? Now you're back to the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You remember that line? Okay. So as we're going through this, did I not make this PowerPoint good enough? Well, if you have to turn it off, you can turn it off, but hopefully we can get through. Just leave this page up. That'll help me as we go along. So they began to war for the next 15 years after he died. And it ended up being that there were 4 basic groups, 4 generals who were able to maintain a place. Now, of the 4, really most of Daniel chapter 11 deals with 2 of them, the king of the north and the king of the south. There was another one called Antigonus. He basically was in the upper Turkey area. He was into Macedonia and part of Greece. He was the 3rd character but the 4th one really never took off. He had a very, very small section that belonged to him. But the first one was Ptolemy. Now, you got to get used to it because there's 17 of them. But it's easy because I'll just simply say Ptolemy and you'll know that I'm talking about Egypt because they were all named Ptolemy. But then there was also the second empire, which was the Northern Empire, and that was the Seleucians. Those people had varying names, and so it's going to take us a while to catch on to that. We're going to use the name Cleopatra I might as well tell you that up front. Oh, by the way, Cleopatra's not Egyptian. Cleopatra is Greek. So again, the names that we look at are not the names that we should really understand. Below the 62 weeks, I've laid out for you basically a semi-timeline, no way to completely bring it from beginning to end, but to basically show you these 62 weeks as he's laying them out for us. And the Babylonian Empire, which we doesn't talk about, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire are really the same empire. And let me take time out and let me explain it to you. Rome originally was the name for all of the provinces that had been conquered by the Romans. But eventually, Constantine decided that he wanted to move his kingdom from Rome. He didn't want to deal with the Pope any longer. And so he moved his kingdom to what we call Constantinople or Istanbul or Byzantium, whichever word you want to use. And at that point in time, he established for himself that was the place for him. And while he was there, he became emperor over the entire piece. But the western half, the half that goes with Italy and Rome, was slowly being eaten away because of the Vandals and all of the Franks. You know, we look at France. Did you realize France really comes from the word Franks, which is German? He was part of that. You know, our language is rather interesting. Who gets to name what? But anyway, back to the story. So that half drifted off, and by the third century, it was gone. But the Constantine, his empire, his half, remained for about 500 to 600 years until finally it was overtaken by changes in the culture. You see, remind yourself that the Greeks originally established, you're part of the culture. The Romans came in and they, for the most part, unless something happened, did not want to mess with culture. They just wanted your money. And in the process, the Byzantine Empire began to change. And it changed quite a bit with Constantine. But in the process of changing, it went from Latin Catholic to Greek Orthodox. The change in language, the change in religion, not a large change, but a change just the same. Constantine began to speak Greek, not Latin. The empire continued on for several hundred more years, but in 638, and 632, I guess, and 613, if you look at my map, 613, there was a guy named Muhammad. Muhammad had tried to join the Christian church because he said that's where God was. Well, the Christian church didn't want him. So he tried to join with the Jewish people, but they didn't want him. But he had all these visions that he was beginning to see that eventually would be codified and put into what they call the Quran. And by 632, he now is actually the beginning of an empire, because at 613, he began to spread his message in Mecca. Oh, by the way, Mecca didn't like him either. They kicked him out. Did him a lot of good because he came back and replaced them. But by 632, what we now have is a Islamic revolution. And Islam began to spread all across the Latin countries, all across the Orthodox Greek countries, all the way along the African coast, even into Spain. That's when we would call them the Moors. So a lot of changes were going on, but that wasn't the end of it. You see, at some point in Turkey, there was a caliphate named Osman. And Osman created for himself what we would call the Ottoman Empire. And he now began to conquer the lands. Over and over and over again, we began to move from one place to another. And the Ottomans were now in charge. And they went all the way up to World War I. By World War I, they were becoming very, very weak. What was happening? Well, the empire was just simply falling apart. You couldn't run your empire from all the different places because there were too many hotspots. And so the empire was falling apart. And we had World War I, and the Turks, Ottomans, decided they would join the side of the Germans. So the Germans and the Austrians and the Turks battled against Britain and battled against our neighbor called France. All of this is going on. Steve, you're amazing. Oh, thank you. Anyway, so back to the story. So as we're going through this, you're catching, never mind. You can shut her off, if you will, because I'm beginning to get caught up in the slides. So if you don't mind me just talking my way through it. And so in the process at World War I, Britain and France were attempting, with the help of Russia, were attempting to stop the Germans. Now, the Germans at that time was Kaiser Wilhelm. Kaiser Wilhelm, the word Kaiser is the word for Caesar. And he got that title from someone who was before him, Charlemagne. Again, another Frank. And the Frankish Kaiser Empire was being built. But in World War I, it was demolished. But we know at the time when it gets demolished, something's rising in its place. And that was Adolf Hitler. And what did he call his group besides Nazis? The Third Reich, the Third Reign. You see, the Germans believed in conquer. And that's what was spurring Adolf Hitler. Now, if we go to the leopard that we found in Daniel chapter 7, remember it had 4 heads? Those 4 heads represented those 4 Greek generals. Well, that leopard had 4 heads. Well, the leopard was the sign of Germany. That was their national symbol. Lo and behold, as the wall fell in Berlin, Helmut Kohl declared, "We are now in the Fourth Reich." Again, he believed that the power of their dollar was going to propel them through Europe. And how did it? They developed an economic union in which who benefits the most from that? The Germans. So we have, again, a repeat and a flow, all of it going from one place to another to another. So at the end of, during World War I, the Turks are beginning to fall apart. Britain decides, let's give them some help. Lloyd George, who was the prime minister at that time, talked with his generals about establishing a revolution among the Arab nations, basically helping to destroy the Ottoman Empire. Who did they pick to lead that? Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence was the general who led the Arab army. You remember Omar Sharif? You remember that whole story? That's what we're talking about. So over and over again, we begin to see things happening, and the nation fell apart. And Britain as a result, and France as a result, the United Nations, well, at that time, said wasn't the United Nations. It was the well, World War I. What was the group? League of Nations. The League of Nations had established that Britain and France would be the custodians of all the Arab countries. They're the ones who named Iraq, Iraq. They're the ones who named the Jordanian, Jordan. They're the ones who named Syria, Syria, Lebanon, Lebanon, Palestine, Palestine, Moab, Ammon, Edom, Saudi Arabia. They named those countries. One of the problems with naming countries, you also have to figure out their boundaries. What if you get two tribes in an area that don't like each other? You see, that was a real problem in those areas. If you went to Iraq, you'd find out there were Sunni Iraqis, there were also Shiite Iraqis, there were also Kurdish Iraqis. Three different groups, none of them liking each other. That's when we ended up with a war, remember, and it was called Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield. That's chapters 50 and 51 in the book of Jeremiah. Those wars are described for us there. Now, as we're going through all of this, we have to understand then that time flows. And so we're going to have a period when things are going quickly and a period when things are going to go slowly. So let's get back to try to make it a little bit quicker. So in verse number 5, if you will, the king of the south, that's Ptolemy's kingdom, will grow stronger than his enemy, and his nobles, and he will overpower him and rule. His dominion will be a great dominion. At the end of many years, they will join together, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to establish uprightness, marriage. But she will not restrain the power of her strong arm, nor will the king nor his arm withstand. So she and those who brought her will surrender as well as one who fathered her, and he supported her in times of need. Excuse me, I have sinus problems right now, allergies. As we're going through this, what we're talking about is the king. First portion of this was the fact that Salme was the strongest of the four men. His kingdom was the most sound. The reason his kingdom was the most sound was he took the advice of Alexander. He didn't try to change everything. He simply became a part of it. The other three all wanted to bring change about. They all wanted the kingdom to look like them. It didn't work that way. Now, as they became stronger and stronger, there was tiffs on the borders. The Antigonus group decided to invade the Seleucians, the northern kingdom. In fact, they conquered them. And the Seleucian king, whose name was Antioch, he moved to go to Egypt, where he was protected by Ptolemy. This is an easy story, right? Ptolemy organized the army. Ptolemy conquered all the land that Antigonus had taken away from Seleucus, from the Seleucid Empire. He gave it back to him. Lo and behold, he became so strong that he actually continued to conquer nations all the way into India to Pakistan. He grew the empire. But what happens when you grow an empire? Well, you also grow your ego. And so his ego was becoming very, very large. In fact, it was so large, he decided that maybe instead of me bowing down to Ptolemy, who saved me, maybe I'll make Ptolemy bow down to me. And so he invaded Egypt. That's when we begin to start what's called the Syrian Wars. There were 6 of them between the king of the north and the king of the south. And much of what you're going to read in chapter 11, all the way up until about the middle of the chapter, will be all the problems that'll happen because of those 2 going at it 6 different times. And no war that they were fighting lasted less than 6 to 10 years. None of them. So imagine all the bloodshed. Imagine something else. Whose country is in the middle between Syria and Egypt? Palestine. War after war trooped through their nation. One minute they belonged to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians taxed them. One minute he belonged to the Syrians, and the Syrians taxed them. Back and forth that went. Sometimes the tax was high, sometimes it wasn't. If it wasn't high, then you didn't mind being under that rule. But there was not a constant. It was always changing. And that's what was going on in this nation at that particular point in time. Now, part of the problem was the fact that these wars were becoming very costly. So things had to be done in order to slow them down. Antiochus II decided that the best way for me to win was I will give my daughter to the king, to Ptolemy. Ptolemy means king, by the way. That's what the word means, or Pharaoh, either way. But in the process of doing that, my daughter is 16 years old. I'm giving her to an 11-year-old to marry. Who's in charge of that home? Who's in charge of that home? Well, Antiochus hoped that it would be his daughter, because if his daughter was in charge of it, I can help her. I can give her advice. Well, her name was Cleopatra, not Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra. This is the first Cleopatra. Elizabeth Taylor was the 7th Cleopatra. But in this particular case, this first Cleopatra, because Cleo is Greek, not Egyptian. She decided that she was going to defend her husband. Now, her husband at 11 years old doesn't make very many good decisions. He has enough trouble knowing when recess is over, if you got the drift of an 11-year-old kid. But she said, what we need to do is we need to establish a treaty with somebody who can help us. I know just the people to ask. We'll go to Kittim. Kittim? Rome. We'll ask the Romans, because their army's much larger and they haven't been involved in all these battles. And so they're fresh. And so Ptolemy at 11 establishes a treaty with the Egyptians and the Romans. Well, Antiochus is ticked. What is going on? I gave my daughter, I gave him the brains to survive. And what does she do? She chooses her husband over me. She didn't even know the guy, but it didn't matter. As it worked out, Antiochus could not invade Egypt because the Romans were protecting them. Time went on. New Ptolemies, new Antiochuses, each and every one of them became a little worse, a little worse. Finally, there came a Antiochus, excuse me, Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus the God. You see, he gave himself that title. Lots of other people considered him a pig. And there's a Greek word that I can't remember how to pronounce it. That was the word that they would use when they talked about Antiochus. But anyway, he again raised a huge army and he went down there, forgetting that the Romans still had a treaty. Again, arriving down there, war broke out. A 9-year war. Finally, at the end of 9, Ptolemy calls on the Romans to come to bail him out. This is where we come to an interesting expression: drawing a line in the sand. Have you heard that expression before? The first time it was used in Egypt, and Antiochus Epiphanes was the target of it. You see, the Romans didn't send an army. They sent a Roman senator and a brigade. Now, the Roman senator, Antiochus recognized him right away. And he says, we have a treaty with the Egyptians. Now, if you attack them, you realize you're attacking us. So what do you think you're going to do? Well, Antiochus says, well, I'm going to think about it. Well, the senator took his staff and he drew a line all the way around Antiochus. Antiochus, when you leave that circle, you're going to tell me what you've decided. That's how much time you have. As long as you stay in the circle, you got all the time in the world. But I want an answer when you walk out of that circle. Now, remember, Antiochus has this huge army. He's only got a brigade plus the Egyptians. He looked and he says, I think I'm going home. So he turned around to leave. Well, that was a bad deal for Israel. Why? I have his whole army. I haven't paid them because they were going to get their reward by sacking Egypt. What are they going to do for a salary? I know. We will take it out on the Israelites. We will sack their homes. We will take their possessions. That is what we will do. But he was mad at even madder than that. And he said to himself, that's not enough. I am going to be so mad. I am going to eliminate their days and weeks and years. They're going to use my calendar. Time is going to change for them. Not only that, I'm going to change the temple service. And you're not going to be allowed to use bulls and sheep and goats and doves and no. The only thing you'll be allowed to use are pigs. That went over real well. But imagine what's going on in the community. You see, there were several people in the community that were called Hellenists. They were Jewish people that liked the Greek lifestyle. And they didn't see anything wrong with changing the religion. What's one animal over another? In fact, they began to lose their Torah. They had been there so long. Yes, they even stopped circumcision. Nothing was going right. And Antiochus began to do this, and he went home, but before he went home, he left a brigade of soldiers who would go from town to town and make them fall in line. Well, they went to the wrong town. There was a man there named Matthew. We call him Matthew. Matthew Hasmonean. We later call him Maccabean because he was a hammer. The Greeks asked him to burn a pig on the altar, and he said, no. We're not leaving until you slaughter the pig on the altar. And he says, no. And another one said, I'll do it. So he volunteers and he goes up to begin to do that. And as he goes up to begin to do that, Matthew slashes his throat. At that point in time, all bets are off and they all begin to war. In fact, that was the start of the Maccabean Wars at that point in time. Now, he was a priest, but he was not of the tribe of Aaron, so he was not a high priest. He was just a Levite. Yet his family led the entire thing. You see, at this particular point in time, things were changing in Jerusalem also. There were a lot of people there that became Hellenists. They also began to be known as Sadducees. There was another group called the Pharisees. And actually, there were 8 groups of Pharisees. And each one had his own version of Torah. The Sadducees said if it's not written in the line by line, it don't count. The Pharisees were at odds in various ways. Their calendars were different, but that they could work that out. But there was one group there who was led by a priest named Zadok. Zadok was a true son of Aaron. And he got to the point where he could no longer stay. So he and many of the others like him left and they moved to Qumran. Now, there was other places where they would go, but many went to Qumran. And while they were in Qumran, they did follow the Jewish ways. They followed the Torah as they understood it, orally and written. They also were responsible for doing what we call writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. 60,000 different scrolls. Now, most of them had dissolved by this century, 1947, 48, but many of them were still whole in some ways. One of my reading now is the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch and the War Scrolls. There were many, many books that were still, the whole scroll was there and they were able to use them. The Book of Isaiah was there. In fact, if you go to Jordan, they have it encased and you can read it if you know your Hebrew letters and you don't need the vowel points. Over and over again, they began to spread out, but they moved away from. And so the religion of Jerusalem was no longer Torah. It was the religion of the Hasmoneans. Well, not only that, there was no king. After winning the battle, one of the brothers became the acting king. Now remember, they're Levites. They're not from the tribe of Judah. They're not even Davidic. So now you have an illegal high priest and an illegal king or monarch. You can imagine the people who followed Torah, the consternation they were in, where they went with this. I'm going to pick up the story next time because I've already talked at you for 55 minutes. I hope I made myself semi-clear. I would have liked to have used my slides, but that didn't work out, so best I got. But I'm getting you to this point when we're going to begin to see the Romans. Then I want to show you Islam. Then I want to show you the Ottomans. And I want to show you Syria. I want to show you Transjordan. I want to give you all of those understandings. And that will take us up to where we're at. But remind yourself, chapter 11 and the first verse of chapter 12 will get us only so far. It'll only get us to 1945, the end of World War II. But from there, I will fill in the pieces and help you understand that on October 6th, 7th of this year, Daniel's 70 weeks were finished. We are now in a new period. It's uncharted. We have spots that we can fill in, but it's uncharted. And so it's no longer about the Gentiles. The time of the Gentiles is over. Now is about the time of the Jewish people. They are the ones that will take us into the world to come. They are the ones. We are along for the ride. But we need to pray. We need to hold them up. Many of them are after this war has started, and many of them have become foxhole Jews, I guess, because they are now coming back and they're now looking at their Torah. I was listening to a podcast on the way home, I think it was, from my daughter's house, in which the gentleman was talking about the first time one of his buddies actually participated in a minyan and put on his first talit and his first phylacteries. So excited to come back to God. Anybody have any questions? Because obviously I was rambling a little bit trying to get through this, but I'm still another week at least away from finishing this chapter. Anybody, questions, thoughts? Go ahead, Sharon.
You said you have Art Scroll, right?
Yes.
Okay, I do too. Daniel, where you were reading, where you finished off at, I found it interesting because at verse 28 of chapter 11, I hope we have the same one, but it's page 133.
Yeah.
All right, when Antiochus dies, well, it's concerning the high priest. The high priest died. And then they mention Onias. And
Onias,
then
yes.
they mention Yeshua, the brother of Onias, who
Correct.
got the name Jason.
Now remember, Yeshua was actually Yehoshua.
Not this guy.
This guy. But he didn't like that name. He took the name Jason.
So he was Hellenized.
He was
Hellenized. Because they were fighting back and forth.
Yeah. Onias was a true Jew. His brother was not a true Jew. His brother wanted to be a member of the Greek society. In fact, he made a deal with Antiochus. If you will allow me to be your representative here in Jerusalem, I will guarantee you that you will collect more taxes than you've ever thought you could. That's what he promised him. He was outbid later on by a man named Menelaus. But at that point in time, it got him a position in the government. And he also became what we would call the chief priest at that point in time. But his name was, you said Yeshua. It's kind of right, but his real name was Yehoshua, Joshua. That's what his real name was. So it's kind of interesting.
Well, this was according to Rashi.
Right.
That was when they put Yehoshua, because that is Hebrew.
Correct. They're both the same. When did Joshua become Joshua? What was his name before he became Joshua?
Yehoshua.
Yehoshua. He begot the Yud from Moses. Moses gave him that letter to become a part of his name, to protect him while he was out and spying.
Well, did you notice in this sporadically, because I put little post-it notes, they mention Christianity in there in Rashi's thing. I don't know. I'm finding it kind of more interesting now because I'm reading the commentary too. So,
well, again, it just to add flavor to the story.
Yeah.
Remind yourself, Rashi is writing in what is called the Dark Ages. Now, Judaism wasn't in the dark. They were having their greatest revelations from Rashi and Rambam and Nachmanides and all of these others, the Vilna Gaon. The Dark Ages described Christianity. Christianity was posing great deals of problems with the Jewish communities. A lot of problems. And so you'll find a lot of writing, not so much in the Talmud, but you'll find it in Midrashic writings. There is a section in the Talmud that deals with Jesus.
Yeah,
You
I
don't
heard
want to
that.
read that part
I
because that,
already did. I already did.
yeah,
But yeah, it was pretty interesting. But Seleucids, aren't they Sadducees? Or correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know, because during
the
Hanukkah,
Seleucians are Greeks.
okay, so because during Hanukkah, that was the Seleucids were brought up a lot.
Correct.
So
That's because they caused all the problems.
right. Things are
So,
just getting ironed out then right now.
yeah. Good thoughts. Good questions. Anybody else? Wow. I pray I got the messages across so far. I'll have to go back next week and we're going to go back to that first page. And I want to add to that first page and help you walk through the Daniel 70 weeks because
Rod,
it is
we can't
far
hear
more
you.
fascinating. Pardon?
Rod's trying to talk, but we can't hear him.
Nope, we can't hear you, Rod. I got it.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. David, you had a comment earlier that you unmuted your mic.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Yeshua is more of an Aramaic word,
Correct.
and Rashi would be very familiar with Aramaic, where Yehoshua is a Hebrew word, a
Correct.
Hebrew name, but it refers to the same. Interesting enough, Yeshua in Hebrew actually means salvation.
Right.
Correct.
But that's all. I was just going to clarify it.
No, I'm glad you said that because when that name comes up, I get kind of a little offended by it. Like, I'm not a messianic, so I don't want to hear it. But then Yehoshua, so
Yeah.
but I have one more question. Never mind, I'll go off, but I do have a question.
You just muted yourself.
Oh yeah, Rabbi Gladstein. I don't know if y'all know who he is. I just really love listening to him. And he mentioned the toes of Daniel. And he said it was Ishmael and Esau. I mean, like, I don't know, but that's what he said. And he said that his grandfather, who was in Dachau, I think it was Dachau or the other one, not Auschwitz, but another one. But he said that his grandfather saw a true picture of what that looked like when not Goebbels, but one of the really bad Nazis was invited the caliphate for I don't know where they were coming from, but he invited,
Jerusalem.
yeah, I guess. And
Well,
but he invited him to visit. And as the Jewish men walked through, they hit them in a way that they couldn't have children anymore. And they would just laugh like it was, he said that was terror. He said that was the first time I saw Ishmael and Esau, what they could do together.
well, and if you go back to the gentleman you're referring to was Yasser Arafat's grandfather. That's the story. Because you see, they were involved with making sure they killed as many Jews as possible. And he was attempting to do the same thing in Palestine at that point in time. So it was a combination that was going on as this whole thing is happening. There was a civil war that was happening in 1932 and 1938 between the Jewish people and, quote, the Palestinians. Two bloody experiences between the two, because the Palestinians understood that the Jews were trying to come there to escape the Holocaust, and they weren't making it. In fact, if it wasn't for Lyndon Baines Johnson diverting 4 shiploads of Jews from Hungary to Houston, there would have been a lot more people dead.
Have you heard, because you guys are from Texas?
No, I'm from
Valley of-
Indiana.
Oh, okay, well, but I'm gonna ask this anyway. Have you heard of Valley of the Jews up in Midland, by Midland, Texas? I wonder if it was up around there, because, I don't know, because I went there to visit once and they said, this is the Valley of the Jews. And I'm like, why did they call that? But maybe it was Lyndon Baines Johnson. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Have no
But you
clue.
know, I just want to ask something since we're on history real quick, because this has been interesting to me. I thought Britain was in control of Jerusalem during the World War. So,
No, yes, they were in control technically. But remind yourself, they had to defend themselves against the Germans who
all
were
right, so
trying to cross through Africa to get to the oil fields in Saudi Arabia. And so many of the Brits ended up in the desert at the valley of El Alamein. They were a part of that war. But there was very few British soldiers during World War II that were actually in Israel.
so it wasn't the Jewish people turning away ships and locking down Jerusalem. It was Muslims. Wow. Because I've heard all these years that it was the Jewish government or whoever was in charge.
Dave knows. Go for it, Dave.
I don't know if anyone realized it, but there were concentration camps in North Africa. What was really cool about it, to give it opposite side, the Algerians and a few of the other people refused to give over their Jews to the Germans. But there were SS camps in there, killing people outright. And the remains are still in the desert within North Africa. So this whole process of destroying Israel was all around. So there were some, we'll call them Arabs, that were involved, but there were many that refused to be part of it at all, and they were actually hiding their Jews.
Yeah.
So we do have a mix of stuff going there.
Okay, then what is going on right now? I think I heard you guys, I came in the middle or something. You guys were talking about something a while back, but about this whole the Muslims that are surrounding is outside of Uzbekistan or I can't even say the name. But right now they're making them go through the mountains. And from what I'm understanding, they're Jewish. Like they've surrounded them and they're forcing like 2 million people to cross the mountains right now. Do you know what I'm talking about, Rod, or anybody who's been listening to world news?
Haven't heard that one before, but that's not surprising. Remind
I've
yourself.
not heard that. I've not heard that. But go ahead. That doesn't mean it's not true.
No, remind yourself when Sennacherib took the first 10 tribes out of the country, he sent them north. He didn't stop them in Syria. He sent them to the Ukraine, to Russia, and several of them continued further towards Siberia, towards Irkutsk, towards Afghanistan, that area. That's why you'll find Jews almost on every spot on this planet. They are practicing their understanding of Judaism. It may not be exactly as the Torah has it, because they may not have had a Torah. They're doing it from oral traditions, but there are Jews everywhere across the world. So at points in time, there have been this attempt to wipe out the Jews or move them along, I guess is another way of saying it. Remember 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but they also marched millions of Jews into the Mediterranean saying die or convert. So it's become a problem across the world that everybody has to deal with. One of the biggest places that they had problems with is Argentina. Why would they have problems with Jews in Argentina? Because the Nazis, when they escaped World War II, settled in Argentina. So there's a new problem in Argentina, basically because of the Nazis that have been relocated down there. Remember, the Pope himself during World War II was actually helping the Nazis. The Pope was actually getting Nazis out of the country on Vatican boats. Rather interesting whole situation. But anyway, that's history.
I think it's Armenia is where that's happening. Armenia, or where the Greek church was for so long, the Orthodox Church, I mean,
Yeah,
the oldest Orthodox church.
yeah.
I know that made me sick about the Pope.
Well, now that I've given you all I know in social studies, anybody have anything further to add? I appreciate you people hanging around to listen to me.
Well, Steve, all I can say is you are a brilliant historian and teacher. I really appreciate your classes, and I hope that other people will come join us live because only our members get to hear this part. And it's just great to see all you guys in class. David, Kura, Lori, Diana, Mike, Mary, Sharon, Peggy, and mysterious man 15746 who can't change it to his real name.
No,
And Steve,
actually, that's his tag number from being in Auschwitz.
oh, okay, we'll let
You
that
just
pass.
you just didn't know that.
I didn't know that, but that's fine. But Steve, thank you very much. I mean,
You're welcome.
I feel honored that you are teaching on the tip. I know I blowed enough smoke up your kilt that you could be high right now, but that's all right. So guys, I'm gone. Whenever you guys want to say Lila Tov, we'll say Lila Tov.
Lila Tov. Have a
Lila
good one.
Tov.